Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 420, Jewtina Eco. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we are excited to have a conversation with another guest who's leading a Jewish organization pushing for the empowerment of Jewish leaders who've been historically marginalized. In our last two episodes, we spoke with Nate DeGroot from the Shalom Center and Elena Fugman from Tish PDX. And today our guest is Analucía Lopezrevoredo, who leads an organization called Jewtina Eco, which is devoted to nurturing Latin Jewish community, identity, leadership, and resiliency via cohort experiences, community storytelling, culturally sustaining learning resources and workshops, and live connection points. Our guest today, Analucía Lopezrevoredo, is Jewtina Eco's founder and executive director. She is a Peruvian Chilean-American sociologist known for her advocacy and research on human migration, immigrant identity development, and global Jewish communities. Before founding Jewtina Eco in 2019, Analucía Lopezrevoredo played a pivotal role at organizations such as Jewtina, Jews indigenous to the Middle East and North Africa, One Table, and Bend the Arc, where she pioneered systems to advance the understanding of global Jewish identity. Early in her career, Analucía Lopezrevoredo served as an investigator for the Center to Advance Racial Equity in Portland, Oregon. She supported migrant women in southwestern Mexico and southeastern Peru, and she was an international educator in contexts ranging from Cambodia to El Salvador to India to Mongolia and many other places. She is the recipient of the National Young Woman of Distinction Award, and in addition to her work at Jewtina Eco, Analucía Lopezrevoredo is also on the JDC Entwine Council, serves on the board of directors of JPRO and of Urban Adama, and is a Wexner Field Fellow. We're really thrilled to have this conversation, so let's get right into it. Analucía Lopezrevoredo, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thank you so much, Dan. I appreciate it.
So, Analucía, I was hoping that you could sort of start by telling us a little bit about what the world was like before Jewtina Eco was created and why that world required the creation of Jewtina Eco.
Thank you. What a great question. So the world before Jewtina Eco, specifically, I have to break it up, right? Are we talking about the world in the United States? Are we talking about the world in Latin America, different parts, I'll start with the United States. What the world looked like in the United States before Jewtina Eco was monolithic in terms of a Jewish context. As someone who grew up in the United States as a Latin Jew, I was very keenly aware that my intersectional identity didn't make sense to many people in a Latin context or in a Jewish context. I spent a lot of my childhood explaining to my Jewish friends that there were Jews in Latin America. And I spent a lot of time explaining to my Latin American friends that one, Peru was a country independent of Mexico. I grew up in Southern California, where big part of the Latino population is Mexican, and that there were Jews that were Latino, whether it was Peruvian and Mexican, the third largest Jewish community in Latin America. Most of the time when I was having those conversations, people were very surprised. And it was, to me, a symptom of poor Latin American education around what does diversity actually look like in that context. Also poor diasporic Jewish peoplehood education, and a lack for really understanding what does the Jewish diaspora mean outside of the US. Oftentimes, people think of Israel and diaspora, and the diaspora means North America, if Canada gets lucky, included in that. But that's so much more than that. And so before Jewtina Eco, I think a lot of people maybe had whispers that there were Jews from different parts of the world. Maybe if they were lucky enough to travel to different places, saw a synagogue, saw something that felt familiar. But for the most part, I think our existence was largely unknown. And to this day, after 4 years of being an organization, we still get emails with a lot of love and appreciation saying, I just found out there are Jews in Latin America. I want to bring this information to my community, to my synagogue, to my kids' school. And that to me just shows that the work is still, there's so much more ahead because we're still in a awakening phase and a reclaiming phase, because I think it's exciting for people to recognize, my gosh, this is part of our story. That's probably the best way to explain what life was like beforehand.
What do we know, or what is true, let's say, as a starting point about not only that there are Jews in Latin America, but how many of them have come to the United States in various ways? Like how much is what we're talking about that there are a lot of Latin American Jews in the United States? And how much are we talking about that there are a lot of Latin American Jews in Latin America?
So if someone asks, when did Jews arrive to Latin America? I think the answer is multi-tiered. The Inquisition led to a number of Jews that were living in the Iberian Peninsula. They were given a short matter of time, 4 months, to either convert or to leave. And even if you converted, it didn't mean that life was easy for you. People knew you still had that scarlet J. People knew that you were a Jew. And so for many people, they changed their names, they moved into a different city, but also many people decided that the best way to start a new life was to join an expedition and make their way to the New World. So the Inquisition does play a major role in Jewish emigration from the Iberian Peninsula to the Americas. But that doesn't mean that there were publicly active Jewish communities in Latin America. But we know that there's existence there. There's history tidbits, there's rediscovered mikvot. And so we know that there was a entry point for Judaism in the early days of Latin American conquest. And so that's one phase. Then you've got folks who come in the mid-19th century as well. Baron de Hirsch is someone who's a very important person in Latin American Jewish history, who's seeing what was happening with the pogroms in Russia and having the resources to buy land in largely unknown Argentina, does so with the idea of bringing folks over. And those are the colones, the colonists, the Jewish colones, different context than in the US, but we'll use that term, that's important. And then, of course, you have migration that comes with the fall of the Ottoman Empire, as World War II really is picking up, and right after that. So all of those things are important to understanding how Jewish Latin America is made. That said, that's not the only way in which Jews are Jews. We've got a number of Jews within our community, the Latin Jewish community, that didn't grow up Jewish and now lead very rich Jewish lives, whether being introduced to Judaism independently or through a loved one, through marriage. We have folks who were born in Latin America and adopted by Jewish families in Latin America and in the United States. And you have folks who have a Jewish parent and a non-Jewish parent, in which so much of their life was navigating those two realities. The question around how many Jews, Latin Jews are there, is complex. There are Jews throughout almost every Latin American country. But in the United States, who is a Latin Jew? There hasn't been a study that's been specifically done to understand Latin Jewry in the United States. AJC was the organization that came closest to it, and around 2014 was when that study took place from BILA, which is the Balfour Institute for Latin American Affairs. Great study that gave us a glimpse into Latin American Jewish peoplehood in the United States that counted under 300,000 Latin Jews that were living in the United States, and also, as you'll see in terms of limitations, oftentimes counting folks who were coming from traditional Latin Jewish households, meaning they had been Jewish also in Latin America. As we expand our thinking as to what makes a Latin Jewish person and a Latin Jewish household, we recognize that that number is a lot higher. We likely aren't counting correctly Latin Jews living in households. So you might be living in a Latin Jewish household, even if you yourself are not a Latin Jew. You might be the only Latin Jew in your household, say if you were adopted from Latin America and raised in a white Jewish family. You might identify differently than your parents as a result of that. And so I think it's, as a researcher, it's interesting to be thinking about all the different ways in which we can be wanting to get that answer, but asking the question differently to really understand the breadth of Latin Jewry. In Latin America, I also think that these numbers are tricky numbers because oftentimes they do count folks who are affiliated in some capacity with an institutional Jewish organization. And something that if folks haven't already heard the episode with Rabbi Juan Mejia, who speaks a lot about the communities that he works with, which have been known within our context as emerging communities, which, to be fair, I do find the term a bit pejorative these days because a lot of these communities have emerged at this point decades ago. And their identity as Jews is still being contested. And we need to be asking ourselves, why? Is it because people still don't think they are committed to Jewish life? Or are there other reasons? Is it socioeconomic? Is it racial? Is it a fear of communities that have become less religious to now have to become more religious because these communities were converted in typically an Orthodox fashion and in an Orthodox expression that is very different than the local community's experience? So there's a lot of these questions that we're asking ourselves now, and also that we should be asking ourselves when we think about what that number actually is. Because these communities that have been known as emerging communities exist in places like Colombia, in Mexico, in El Salvador, in Brazil. Brazil has many, many communities that have been reconnecting to their Jewish identity. And so that's another big element to this question, this story. And even though I love research, I don't know if we'll ever get the exact number, because I think there's always going to be something that we're going to miss in a study. And so hopefully wherever it is that curiosity takes us, we leave ourselves open to our own concept of that being widened.
I'm really noticing the timeline of your organization. You were launched in 2019, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that that's important on a number of levels. I mean, you're pretty new and entering, the 5-year zone. Mazel's on 5 years. But there's a number of projects that launched 2019 or maybe even more recently sometimes, that I'm going to start by saying there's many projects geared towards Jews of color that have launched in that time period for a lot of reasons that I think are probably straightforward to folks. There's been, forgetting just Jewish life, much increased discourse about everything from Black Lives Matter to thinking about white supremacy and thinking about how our societies have been built around not everyone. And in Jewish life, there's been a new commitment to telling a more full story of who Jews are. It's not that you or other Latin Jews weren't already thinking about that. I think clearly you were living it. But for those of us who are white Jews, there has lately been more of a commitment financially and otherwise to making our Jewish communities live up to the diversity that is already present. Lunar Collective launched around a similar time, an organization serving Asian American Jews. And you started with the word monolith, right? And I don't think you're perpetuating the idea of a monolith, but I think whenever you're helping people learn about a group of people for the first time that they're not part of, you want them to take in the diversity of that experience, but you also need to distill and tell a story that will sink into people. And so because you started by talking about the monolithic tale of American Judaism that a lot of us have received, which is to say, there's Ashkenazi Jews that immigrated from Europe by and large between 1880 and the 1920s. And that's most American. That's not the fullness of the story. I'm curious if we can break down the potential of a monolith of there's sort of one Latin Jewish story in the United States. You've alluded to people who are Latin Jews whose families have been Latin and Jewish for a long time. You've alluded to people who converted. What are different groups within this broader context that we might benefit from being aware of so that we don't fall into that trap of thinking that, recent converts, that's what a Latin Jew is on the one hand, or people who immigrated here hundreds of years ago on the other hand?
I'll start by saying that 2020 was a year for racial reckoning for folks within and outside of the Jewish community. And as exciting as it was to see, even though it came with a lot of grief, on the heels of a lot of grief and a lot of loss, I think if you are a Jew of color or someone who identifies as a multicultural Jew, multi-ethnic, multiracial, however it is that you are expressing your intersectional Jewish identity, it was also painful to see how long it had taken the Jewish community to recognize, we're a smaller community. One of the things that we pride ourselves on is that we are close-knit, that we do a really good job of organizing, of memorializing our history. And that wasn't necessarily true in a multicultural Jewish context. In 2019, the reason Jewtina Eco started, as I mentioned, I don't know if I mentioned this, I'm a sociologist. And prior to starting Jewtina Eco, I worked exclusively with migrant Latino communities in Latin America and then in the United States. And while I was in a doctoral program, I started working in the Jewish space. And I started lending a lot of my passion for storytelling in a Jewish context, in a multicultural Jewish context, to Jewish spaces. And that's what really led me to start Jewtina. That also coincided with the fact that the middle of September to the middle of October is Latin Heritage Month. I saw it as an opportunity to, in that context of storytelling in a national context, how can we lift up Latin Jewish stories? And the response to it was so positive that it was an easy transition for me as I was wondering, like, where is the next, how do I want to impact the Jewish community, the Latino community next and differently? That was the answer. And the racial reckonings of 2020 allowed for people to learn about Jewtina a lot quicker than they maybe would have. It's wild to think that if that hadn't happened, how that might have changed the way in which people understood or cared to understand about Latin Jewish peoplehood. And also, I think it's interesting because the Latin identity is complex. It's multiracial, it's multi-ethnic, multilinguistic. Not all Latin Jews identify as people of color. Many Latin Jews come from backgrounds where all of their parentage or grandparentage came from European immigration. I come from a mixed family background. My father's not Jewish, and we have rich Andean roots that I'm very proud of, and many other Latin Americans do. And I think that was an important reality, is that when we were serving this community that has felt disenfranchised in the United States and in a Jewish context, there's going to be some conversations that we were going to have with some folks around how does race play a role in this? Because some folks, didn't feel like that was the identity that would best met their experience, but understood why, in the United States in particular, that the person of color experience as a Latin Jew was going to be very different than in Latin America. We're not a monolith. Not only do we represent a number of different national identities throughout Latin America, the American identity geographically also plays an important role. If you are a Latin Jew that was raised in Florida, Miami, Aventura specifically, or if you are a Latin Jew from San Diego, you are going to have a very different experience based on what were the cultural values around you. Also, as I was mentioning earlier, we've got folks who have a very direct tie to Jewish identity or Jewish peoplehood in Latin America. And we have folks who were born in the States and their Latino parent is not Jewish. And so they're continuously having to navigate, am I more Latino in this space or am I more Jewish in this space? Does it even make sense to think, am I more of this or more of that? Or is that not really even helpful to any context around identity? It also is an impact if you were born in Latin America and raised by a white Jewish family, or if you were raised by a Latino Jewish family. And we have members of our community who were raised in white Jewish families as an adoptee, and their Latino identity really doesn't come to them until much later, when they feel like they have permission to explore that without hurting the family that they grew up in. So that's a whole other layer of complexity that not all Latin Jews will understand. And of course, Latin Jewry for folks who didn't grow up Jewish and now lead Jewish lives. When people ask us who's a Latin Jew, most of the time, actually, people will think it's because you converted or because you were adopted. Those are like two of the biggest things that we will get. And I'm not talking about non-Jews. I'm talking about from Jews. You were adopted or you converted. People don't recognize that you can be a Latin Jew by being a Jew from Latin America, and forget that you can be a Latin Jew by having a parent that's Jewish and a parent that's not Jewish. There's also this identity that's can't be placed in any one particular one of those buckets, but it's the identity of folks who are returning to Judaism. And that's something that we always want to explore with folks, returning to Judaism in the context that they have either they're on a spiritual journey, they are on an ancestral journey, and find themselves connecting to Jews from the Inquisition, finding refuge in the Americas, and somewhere along the lines losing touch with their Jewish identity. Some folks might identify folks who are going through that experience as converts. Some folks might identify folks who are going through that experience as uniquely returning Jews, and some folks don't know where to place them. And that's the thing, is like I've given you these buckets, but it's not really so much about buckets, because these experiences also are impacted by so many other things that I mentioned: geography, language. Do you know Spanish? Do you know Portuguese? Does that impact how Latino you feel? Similar question for people whether or not they speak Hebrew or have never had Shabbat at home. Are they Jewish enough? These questions about being enough also complicate, in a positive way, in terms of like the dialogue that we like having with our community, what it means to be a Latin Jew in America today.
The question I wanted to ask next is sort of just a little bit tachlis, a little bit practical about what your organization does day to day. And I wanted to start with one particular piece that I was reading about and hearing testimonials from, the Puentes Fellowship, which talk about having it be really clear cut that this is not a monolith. I mean, you have such an incredible set of people who have participated in this fellowship. I know it's only been around for a few years, but already you have a really cool collection of people from all sorts of different places, all sorts of different backgrounds. And As a segue to getting into sort of the what of what your organization is, I mean, this is amazing broader context, but now there's the question of like, okay, so you identified a set of Jewish communal problems, a set of ways we needed to grow and improve as a community. You also started giving people the tools so that they could create Jewish experience themselves and not just try to sort of agitate or improve other things. So talk to us about that Puentes Fellowship, and if there's other pieces of your organization that are relevant to the work you've started to do to sort of create this incredible cohort of Latin Jews, not just being participants in other Jewish things, but becoming leaders.
When Jewtina started, as I mentioned earlier, it was in connection to Latin Heritage Month that was taking place. And we collected stories, and that led into our Voces project, which is a collective community. It's a community archive of stories. And if you browse through those stories, just by looking at people, you notice that there is a wide range of folks that will likely have a wide range of experiences in both a Latin and Jewish context. I knew that when Jewtina started, that the storytelling piece was going to be an important piece, but that the other important piece, as a lover of community building, as a lover of leadership development and identity development, that we needed to create a container for people who identified as Latin and Jewish to come together and explore some of the most scary and relevant topics and themes related to being a Latin Jewish person today. Puentes, it's had 3 iterations, 3 cohorts. We started our 4th cohort in January of 2024. The mission of Puentes is to not only inspire Latin Jews and empower Latin Jews through a myriad of tools to become leaders within their communities, but it's also to root them deeply in culturally responsive Torah and to also root them deeply in community. People are coming from large cities like New York or LA, but they're also coming from smaller areas like Milwaukee or Minneapolis. Oftentimes, it's going to be a much different experience for folks who aren't even accustomed to seeing as many diverse Latinos as you would in New York or in LA, right? So we know the experience is going to vary, and we know that so much of that process is going to be an important process because they're coming together. And that's also breaking a lot of that monolith thinking, because even within Latin Jews, depending on your experience, you might think that other Latin Jews have your experience. We don't escape also the tendency to want to shortcut and engage in monolithic thinking, even if we've been disenfranchised by it. And so Puentes really allows to create the opportunity to expand our understanding of Latin Jewry and to root us in Torah in a way that we're not only connecting to it through our own lived experiences, but also complementing that learning with also learning around Latin American identity and history and seeing those two as complementary and even more empowering and enriching to who we are as people. Our community, our Jewish community, has almost had our identities stolen from us in terms of we're trying to unflatten what has been flattened for us unwillingly. And as the United States is a relatively a new country. And so nation building oftentimes requires people to be at the lowest common denominator as possible. And so we're really wanting to, now that we're at this next stage of nation building, be able to break that up a bit and really enjoy the diversity that makes us who we are. It results in a cohort of people not just coming together and creating these rich ties with one another, but also stepping away with an understanding that Torah is multicultural and that you don't need to have a particular experience to connect with Torah. You are just as necessary in a Jewish community. Your leadership, your presence, it makes a difference for people that look like you and for people that don't, that also need to be reminded and really lift up that we are a Jewish peoplehood, that we are a global Jewish peoplehood.
So can you talk a little bit about the experience or the curriculum of the Puentes Fellowship and like what a person comes in, more significantly, I guess, what they come out with when they finish the fellowship and they go back to their communities? Is what they're doing, and is the hope that they would go into the Jewish community, they'd become active in a synagogue, or they would, join the board of the day school? Or is it more that they're creating communities of Latin American Jews in all kinds of places all over the country so that it's not just the 20 or so, however many people are lucky enough to be Puentes Fellows, but that there's actually something like a growing set of organizations for Latin Jews. I'm actually wondering a little bit about, like, is it kind of like the LGBTQ world of 40 years ago or 30 years ago that said, hey, we're going to create a bunch of our own institutions because we need to sort of develop our own identity first before we're able to, go in. And now we see LGBT folks, I think, are the majority of rabbinical students today in America. And that was a kind of a theory of change. And I'm wondering if it's a similar theory of change here or a different theory of change.
For Puentes Fellows, there are different points in time in their arc of learning that involve them, one, being in connection and being rooted in the group, as well as being also rooted in what are our leadership values and also what is the leadership philosophy, and what are those two things, how are they influenced or impacted by the story of peoplehood, both in a Jewish context and in a Latin context. Over the last couple of years, we started to incorporate Musar, which is a study of Jewish ethics or Jewish character development, and typically involves students doing a lot of personal or partner study and really looking at how different midot or Jewish values play a role in the way they lead, in the way in which they process difficult situations, in the way in which they introspect, in the way in which they heal. As Jewish leaders and as Jewish leaders of color, for the majority of people who identify themselves in that space, we really find the study of Musar as being critical to resilience building. Similarly, we have, as I mentioned earlier, culturally responsive Torah. We're currently in conversations around what does it mean to believe and how does belief play a role in leadership? And when we talk about even naming the divine, how does coming from a community or a culture where masculinity and machismo play such an integral role, like how are women a part of this conversation? How does the way in which a larger community connect to religious belief, in particular Catholicism, also impact the way in which we think about God? And that's not something you get in other Jewish spaces, but it's something that's imperative. And we touch upon different things in each session. Of course, we've got in-person retreats that allow us to really dig into things a bit deeper. We've got Havrut. We really love partnered learning. So Havruta learning is such an integral part to this experience. Also, we have something that we started to institute during our third cohort, which is a capstone project that is led by fellows that is meant to bring something that was missing, to create something that was missing in their community. We are not consumers of Jewish history or Jewish thought, we are co-creators. 2,000, 3,000 years from now, this time is going to be looked back upon, and we're hoping that we also get to be a part of that story. And that calls for creation, for co-creation. What's been missing in their communities? What's something that they could add to complement the experience of Latin Jewish peoplehood in their spaces? Some folks will host a book club that is explicitly centering Latin Jewish authors and is doing so in a Latin Jewish context. Others are creating writing courses in their schools. Some folks are creating festivals to bring awareness around Latin Jewish peoplehood. So that project is diverse based on interest and what it is that people are doing. But outside of those capstone projects, once that is finished, yes, our goal is for folks to, whether it's to join boards of an institution or to apply for a Jewish job or to consider rabbinical school, to be more actively involved in Jewish organizing in their secular company. And now more than ever, I think it's so imperative that we are able to step into these roles, because I do think that Latin Jews and Jews of color and intersectional Jews, one thing that we know how to do really well is understand nuance. Our ability to carry nuance and to be bridges is imperative to being able to get to the next stages of coalition building.
So you used a word, co-create, that I want to live in for a bunch of reasons. One, Jewtina e co. There's a co right there. That syllable is very important to your organization in a bunch of ways.
Yes.
I was geeking out and I saw that you have 5 co's. The prefix is very important to your organization. I'm not going to say too much more because I want you to be able to give us your co, Torah. I bring it up because it's a Spanish prefix, the way that you use it. And I think that does matter. I mean, you already mentioned not all Latin Jews are Spanish speakers, and we shouldn't paint with broad brushes. And I do think that it is worth noting and commenting on the fact that there are a lot of Latin Jews and Latin people who speak more than one language.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot about the grand scope of Jewish history, and I try not to distill anything to this is the essence of Judaism, blah, blah, blah. But one thing that if I were forced to find some essences is bilingualness, or knowing multiple languages has been important in a lot of different places in the world, whether that's knowing Hebrew and some other language in whatever area people are inhabiting. But often there's a way in which Jewish texts, Jewish traditions are speaking across multiple languages, to the point that sometimes we have words and stories where we're not even sure whether, karpas from the Passover Seder, does it come from Persian? Does it come from Greek? There's all these interesting discussions about like which family of languages do certain words come from, because we're so embedded in so many. For many American Jews, especially those of us who are European descended, it's not that there's none of us that are bilingual. Of course there are, but it's not always like as much a part of our cultural identity. And so I guess my question is sort of like, having access to multiple languages can really be hugely beneficial to Torah. It can lead to things like having 5 wonderful ideas that are the crux of an organization that are neither in English nor in Hebrew, but that speak deeply to people. So like, can you talk to us a little bit about the power of having a contingent of people, not everybody, but many of whom have access to multiple languages, and how that can sort of yield amazing Jewish learning and teaching?
Yeah. So actually, I think this is a really great opportunity to start about our name. Oftentimes people will hear Jewtina, Jewtina Iko, Jewtina Anko. People, won't know where to go. The correct way to pronounce it, the way we intended it, was Jewtina Iko. If we get that far, people will then say, oh, so it's an organization, if they're able to decipher the portmanteau, the combination of words, Jewish and Latina. So you serve Latin Jewish women. It's like, oh my goodness, thank you for saying that. So Spanish and Portuguese, which are the 2 primary languages that we connect to in Latin America, we have, similar to Hebrew, feminine and masculine ways of using certain words. Jewtina does not stand for Latin Jewish women. Jewtina stands for alegría, cultura, and familia Jewtina. So it's joy, culture, and family. So all of those 3 words, which are really important words to Jewish life, are regarded in a feminine context. And so Jewtina is the word that connects to that. And the Iko was an important piece for us because these things, alegría, joy, cultura, culture, familia, family, are able to exist because of a number of different things that also complement that and hold it together. And that's where our 5 Kos come up. And those are our values. So it's important. It's nice to have our values directly in our name. A lot of folks won't know that. But it also is part of an understanding that we are a community. So we're a collective. And there's a lot of folks who are part of our experience. There's Latin Jewish folks who are partnered or who are in community with loved ones that are not Latin Jews, but they're part of that Latin Jewish community building. So they're also part of the Iko and folks and company. But those 5 Kos that refers to is, as I was mentioning, is comunidad, which is community, conservación. How do we center Latin Jewish culture? Colaboración, collaboration. Really, how is it that we support this context of Jews helping other Jews in a way that feels like they have this mutual responsibility, the concept of arivut, which is that mutual responsibility. Conocer, which is connected to limud, which is about learning. And continuity, right? The Lador Vador piece. And so which is continuity of one generation to the next generation. So those 5 goals are the reason why we do everything that we do as a Latin Jewish community. And we also do those things when we are in deep coalition with also the larger Jewish community and the larger Latin community. And when it comes to language, I think language it's such a beautiful thing about Jewish peoplehood is that Jews have lived really all over the world. That has meant that Jews have carried with them, typically, depending on how long they were in a place, an immigrant identity, like picking up pieces from a place where they had once left. And oftentimes that involved language. And then also having to integrate themselves in a local community that required them in order for them to succeed financially, economically, socially, culturally in another language. That is the story of Jewish peoplehood. We've always been a yes and kind of experience in terms of like, how do you communicate? Do you know this language or do you know this one? It's like, yes, and the third one. But I think when you're in the United States, because of nation building and and I think Israel is very similar, people's names changed to modern Israeli names. Hebrew really became, this is what we're going to learn. And anything else that you're bringing with you, you're not going to learn because we're trying to nation build. And also there's a lot of loss there. And a lot of Jewish history shows up in words as well. In January, we had a film release, a film premiere in LA with a director and producer named Danny Rothstein. And Danny Rothstein lives in Mallorca. And he created a documentary film called Jewetta Island, which is specifically about Jewish families that had been forced to convert to Christianity. They have a special name. Some people in other parts of the Iberian Peninsula are known as conversos, which are new Christians, new converts. Chueta people are the name that the local Mallorquín, the people from Mallorca, gave to folks who had converted who had once been Jewish. And there's even a word in Catalan that references essentially Shabbating. It basically means doing Saturday. And what that means is that's when you're cleaning your house and you're doing it with your doors open, so that way people can see that you are not Jewish because you're working on Shabbat and that you have converted. And that word now is used throughout the island for anyone doing busy work on Saturday. That's something that you wouldn't know unless you have a context to culture and to language. And so I think that that's the piece around language that sometimes we miss that comes about when we rededicate ourselves to wanting to learn something new that connects us to our past.
So we've talked a bunch about the Puentes Fellowship, and you talked a little bit about the Voces podcast and that project. I'm curious for you to tell us the other things that Jewtina Eco is doing. And related to that is a question of why. And I'm curious about the things that Jewtina Eco is not doing. I'm interested in the world of things that Jewtina Eco is not doing that you think somebody should be doing. Are those things that you aspire for Jewtina Eco to one day be able to do? Or do you imagine a world in which there are a number of things that really, for the values, for the things that you're trying to make happen in the world, they need to happen? But it's probably not the mission of Jewtina Eco to do those things. And I'm curious if you could paint the picture of, what's really needed for the world to be, set right.
The answer is a lot. We have different ways in which we engage with our community. In 2023, we had 17 programs across the United States, from partnering with a Mexican Jewish film festival to a Latin Jewish family festival to nights out as a community on Broadway to having Shabbat dinners in DC to having learning with an artist in residence in Chicago. So we have national programs throughout the years. And those programs are really created to build community in a way that roots Latin Jewish learning and it is able to bridge Jewish community or Latin community to a Latin Jewish context. We have community managers in some local cities like New York and LA, and our hope is to have more community managers across other local cities so those communities are able to have that personalized attention even more. In addition to events, we also have resources. So we've created learning resources for just about every Jewish holiday. They all started off as bilingual resources. Now they are becoming trilingual, including Portuguese, because that's a big part of the community that we serve. And in addition to Jewish learning, we did a resource around Dia de los Muertos, which is Day of the Dead, as an opportunity for folks to also learn, how do we grieve in a Jewish context? How does that connect to different ways Latin Americans grieve? We also have different kinds of cohort learning. So we've started to implement a number of different global experiences. So in the last couple of years, we've done 2 trips to Mexico. We have done a trip to El Salvador in partnership with Mitsui Collective, a trip to Colombia to understand how Jewish communities show up in these distinct countries, and also how different things that the countries are experiencing impact Jewish identity and Jewry. In terms of what we're not doing, there's so much that can still be done, right? We are a team of 6, and we're growing, but slowly. And we would love to be able to have so much more staff to be able to do so many more things. And we're getting there. And in the meantime, I think there's other organizations doing really important work. JOTA, it's the acronym for JOTA, Jews of the America, which is led by Dr. Dalia Wassner. She is at Brandeis, and she has been really looking at, through an academic lens, like how do we talk about Jews throughout the Americas? Also, I mentioned earlier, BILA, the Balfour Institute for Latin American Affairs, that's from AJC, the American Jewish Committee, and they do a lot of really great public affairs work. It feels really good to be a part of this larger network. We're the only organization that does the community engagement piece, but it would be silly to think that there's not so many other ways in which Latin Jews are engaging with Jewish community or Latin community. And of course, outside of the Latin context, we're part of a larger JOC context. And as I mentioned, we're a multiracial community. So you can be Latin and Jewish and also identify as Asian American or Black. And so it's wonderful to have relationships with Lunar or the Black Jewish Liberation Collective and be able to say, these are other groups that can also serve to nurture your Jewish identity in America. There's so many, we're part of a network. I think it's our responsibility to always be thinking about how we can be connecting folks to different parts of that network.
We were talking about language earlier. I have another linguistic-based question. I mean, we've talked on the show a number of times about looking at Ivrim, the Hebrew word for like the Hebrews, as boundary crossers. It's related to the Hebrew word for those who transgress in the sense of transgressing boundaries. Today, I want to think about it not just as boundary crossers, but as border crossers. I think we sometimes fail to notice or really internalize that almost all of the core characters in the Torah begin their life in one place and end it in another place. And when we read it, it says like, okay, and Abraham was in Ur, and then he was in this other, and like, oh, he goes down to Egypt, and like we know that, but we don't really soak in that like that's not just a passing detail. I think it's a core feature of this story. And of course, with like the real juicy part of the narrative, a bunch of people start their life as slaves in Egypt and end it, actually not in the promised land yet, but in like the desert wandering. A bunch of people start their lives wandering in the desert and then end it in the land of Canaan. There's all sorts of moments where people are immigrants, basically. Now, it's anachronistic a little bit to talk about it that way, but also I don't want us to be too nervous to draw parallels, because I think we should hold dearly that the story we have as our bread and butter, Jewishly, is a story about immigration. I was wondering, I mean, I asked about before, like, how powerful it is to have people who speak multiple languages and can bring Torah across multiple languages. I think if we ever have a moment in Jewish history where we are not actively seeking out voices of people who are immigrating, I think we're falling short. And so given that this is a group that Latin Jews, again, not exclusively, not monolithically, but that many folks who are Latin Jews have immigrated from in either themselves or their families recently, and given that others of us, our families might have immigrated, but longer ago, how might people channel the Torah of immigration into the world, and to what extent are y'all already doing that? And I guess more basically, like, how do we get past the impulse of, oh, you're not from here, you must not know us, to, oh, you're not from here, that's actually amazing, and why you should be in front of our spaces teaching us how to live Jewishly in more expansive ways.
Yeah, so I want to start my response with something you said at the end in terms of learning from people that have immigrated and like, how do we learn from them? I think it's an important phrase because oftentimes when something feels different and we want to learn from them, we do so in a way that's exotifying them. Like, oh, what is it about you that makes you who you are? And I think that oftentimes has to do with the reality that we don't look at within ourselves. What are our moments of migration, or what are our moments of moving from a narrow place, right? Like Mitzrayim, like we're all moving from one place to another. And for some, that is very clearly related to immigration. And people immigrate to a place like the United States for a wide range of reasons. Some of them, it's for a work opportunity. Some of them, it's because they're trying to escape a really dire situation somewhere else. I'm big on storytelling, and I think we all have a story to tell. Even if it doesn't feel so clear that our story from moving from one narrow place to the other, maybe it's not as clear to us. Maybe it's not as obvious as migrating from, like my example, migrating from Peru to the Americas, right? As we begin to tell our stories, and as we also do the responsibility of opening up ourselves to being able to say, okay, someone who's moved across the country or changed jobs in a different field, of course, things might be a little bit different. But I think that when we're looking at how we're continuously bridging worlds, or how we're continuously as human beings living across so many different borders, I think it's vital to also our story as people. And so I love the border piece. For us at Puentes, we are bridges, right? Puentes means bridges. And we spend a lot of time in our first gathering really digging deep into the writings of Gloria Anzaldúa, who was a Chicana writer, feminist, who was so vital to thinking about identities for folks who are at the borderlands of so many different realities that are rich and at the same time unique. And so I think that we've got a lot of opportunity to be thinking about what borders can mean to us, to see it, borders as borders, and also see within our own lives how our borders also integral to our identity building and our community building as a whole.
Thanks so much, Analucía, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. Before we mention the ways that you can be in touch with us, we also want to encourage you to go to Jewtina's website, jewtina.org. That's jewtina.org. It's the perfect spot to learn more about their work, and if you yourself want to become involved with it, also the place to go. And in terms of us, we love when you are in touch with us with questions, ideas, comments, visions, anything you've got related to the present and future or past of Jewish life. Please be in touch. There's all these different ways you can do so. First, there's our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram accounts. All of those are at Judaism Unbound for our handles. Second, there's our website, JudaismUnbound.com, where you can find show notes for this episode and all sorts of other resources. And third, we really love when you email us at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com with any follow-ups related to conversations we've had, ideas you have for our work, whatever calls to you, please be in touch via email at those addresses. Last but not least, we are so grateful for financial support that you are able to send our way. It makes a huge difference. It allows us to provide financial aid for our Yeshiva students who need it. It makes sure that we are able to offer the vast majority of our work, including this podcast, for free. It really is important to what we do. You can send us a monthly recurring donation, even if it's just, $3 monthly, or a one-time gift at JudaismUnbound.com/donate. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.